Recently, I finally beat The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess after trying to get into the game for pretty much what was my entire life. It was my first Zelda game, and ironically, the last one I needed to finish to have played them all, and it was, well, I'm not gonna lie here, the game was a wild roller coaster, but by the end of the game, well, what can I say that I haven't said already? It was a Zelda game, I absolutely loved it, and today, we're fulfilling my promise and ranking all of the major dungeons present in the game, the Forest Temple all the way to Hyrule Castle. If you're new to the channel and are interested in my full thoughts on the game, I did make a review on Twilight Princess, so if you're interested, you can find the link to the video in the description down below. But with that out of the way, let's rank the dungeons in The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. Starting off the list in dead last, we have Hyrule Castle. This dungeon comes to mind whenever I feel like being angry. This was such a disappointing final area to a Zelda game. It is just so boring. This is both when it comes to the problem solving and just visually. You're going to find me comparing things in this game a ton to older Zelda titles, specifically Ocarina of Time, because I believe it to be the golden standard of Zelda games, and no, it's not because I grew up with the game. I was born in 2004. That honor goes to Breath of the Wild, but holy crap, man, the way Ganon's Tower was treated in Ocarina of Time, and even Wind Waker, was leagues better than Twilight Princess. I get this game as the dark and gritty Zelda title fans have wanted for so long, but this just does it terribly. When you're outside the castle, there is absolutely no music. You just fight your way in through hordes and hordes of enemies until you actually make it into the castle proper, and I hope you like the colors gray and orange, since those are really the only colors you find in this area. It's so visually uninteresting and desaturated. It has no unique look to it other than it being the castle, but that just goes, you know, it's a castle. It goes about being the castle in the most mundane and predictable way. I just hate it. Most of the puzzles in this dungeon rely on your lantern for some reason, being able to light and put out fires. Ooh, how engaging. I mean, along the way, there are some fun fights with tougher enemies, and of course, the awesome final battle with Ganondorf. Ganondorf being really the only redeeming factor to this area. Like, yeah, he's cool and all, but I gotta say, Zelda's got a big and boring house. I don't have much else to say. Love you, Ganondorf, but please take over a cooler castle next time. It's very nice knowing that the next entry on this list is far better than Hyrule Castle. And just because I said it was better than Hyrule Castle doesn't make it a good dungeon to me. Next up, we have the Goron Mines. Hell, I'd go as far to call this dungeon mid. It's not bad, I just didn't have a lot of fun with it. The Goron Mines has a lot of cool ideas in it. I think the use for the iron boots is really dang cool, using them to stick onto special walls, and the bosses use the item very well. But at what cost? This thing sucks! I want to like how these are incorporated into the game, and for the bosses specifically, I love them. They are used very well, but the whole wall climbing mechanic falls flat on its face because you go so dang slow. This is especially true when you want to find all of the secrets in the dungeon. It's not a long trek either, but the time it takes to get there almost make these rewards not even worth it. What? Is Link not strong enough for some heavy boots? He has no problem tossing around 400-pound men in their basements. What's the problem here? This guy is stacked. He should have zero problem running around. The iron boots and their pacing bump the dungeon down to a C tier. Everything in the dungeon is relatively fine. Like, there's nothing great about it, but there's nothing outright terrible either. This is until I put on the goddamn iron boots and think about things I shouldn't. If the walk speed was normal or heck, even tolerable in this dungeon, I'd say this move up to be a high B dungeon. But this game came out in 2006, and I don't think Nintendo has any plans to update their game like the lazy developers they are. You just lost a customer, Nintendo. A real loyal one, too. Have fun with that dent in your sky-high money pile. Next on our list is the City in the Sky. I've been told that this might be an unpopular opinion. Is it, though? I wouldn't have any idea. I'm not gonna lie, this dungeon started out extremely poorly for me, and I can't even think of a genuine reason why. I felt like I was just kind of going through the motions with this dungeon. It could be just the fact that I wanted to get through this dungeon relatively quickly as I knew I was close to the end of the game, but who knows. The aesthetic of the dungeon itself is actually really cool. It's not something we see super often in the Zelda franchise. That is until they make an entire game about being in the sky immediately after. Twice. but I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to those games soon enough. I just wasn't a fan of this dungeon and what it had to offer. That is until I got the double claw shot after facing the mini-boss, which was pretty fun. The double claw shot bumped this dungeon up a few notches for me, but at the end of the day, it isn't really saying much, considering how much I disliked the dungeon before the halfway mark. The puzzles are revolving around said claw shot, and those are really fun and unique, and is yet another idea that we haven't really seen in the Zelda franchise up until this point, which helps it stand out a tremendous amount. Swinging from area to area before blocks fall, or fitting into a specific piece before you get there is really fun. But at the end of the day, the dungeon is still kind of mid in my opinion. I mean, it's not so egregious to where I loathe going through it, but it's also not good enough to where I look forward going through it, if that makes any sense. And it's a shame too, considering how strong the dungeons truly are in this game. The boss as well, in my opinion, just took way too long. It was very cinematic and fun to go through, I guess, but I personally think it dragged on for a little too long. I don't have much else to say on this dungeon. Let's keep going. Here at spot number 6, we have the Forest Temple. With this temple being on a relatively low spot on the list, you would think my opinions on it might not be the most positive, yet that's where you're completely wrong. Everything from here at the Forest Temple onwards are all dungeons that I really enjoy, as I've stated in my Twilight Princess review, which you should go watch, link in the description. Look, I'm gonna level with you. This game has a lot, oh god, almost too many lows, primarily being the downtime it takes to get to the dungeons toward the beginning of this game, and this is just the greatest example of that. To get to the Forest Temple, you need to go through about 2 entire hours of game before you can enter the dungeon proper, and while there still are decent sections in that downtime, I think it just takes way too long to get there. But if you've watched my review of this game, you also know that I think the highs of this game make up for any lows or downtime tenfold, and again, the Forest Temple section is a fantastic example of that. Now, while it may not be as good of an introduction as the Great Deku Tree, it is one of the strongest introductory dungeons to any Zelda game, and I mean that. I mean, hey, if you can make the boomerang of all items a fun item to use, that's just a win in my book, alright? Like, instead of it just being a really weak item that you'll never really use once you get the bow, the boomerang has wind properties to it, and it just allows for some amazing puzzles. Things like using your lantern to light up torches that reveal new pathways, but coming back later to use the Gale Boomerang to put out set fires to reveal even newer pathways is just, it requires great critical thinking for first-time players. This was a very satisfying moment when I found out you could do this, and it was resulted with a heart piece. That's awesome, dude! Now, the only real negative I would give this dungeon is my personal unbiasedness towards the boss. Not everything could be as great as I wanted it to be, and this boss just really freaking sucked. I found it to be really repetitive and just overall not fun, but everything else in the Forest Dungeon was absolutely top-notch. Was it worth the 2 hours of downtime required to get there? No, but it was still a great introductory dungeon. It perfectly sets the tone of the game and gives you a fantastic idea on where things are heading. Approaching the top 5, I present to you the Twilight Palace. This is definitely the weirdest dungeon in the game, primarily because of how sectioned off it is and how repetitive these puzzles are. This game doesn't really present itself as a dungeon, at least in the traditional sense, my closest comparison being the Forsaken Fortress from Wind Waker. The only difference being the Twilight Palace is actually fun to go through, which by my own logic, that would make the Twilight Palace the first pseudo-dungeon I actually enjoy in the franchise. The primary gimmick of this dungeon is being the fights with Zant and grabbing onto an orb of light while being chased by a floating hand. This is what really made the dungeon shine for me. There aren't very many puzzles in Zelda that require quick, on-your-feet thinking like this one. You go through this song and dance a few times, and you walk down this long corridor full of enemies and puzzles until you fight Shadow Zant, where you're able to grab the Orb of Light and go back through the same area while also being chased by a floating hand. You have to place the orb in specific places to make the terrain change and make sure you grab it in the right spot, otherwise the hand will take it back to the start. With this, you have to be very quick at figuring out what you need to do and act upon it. This adds a lot of fun tension to the area, and it all culminates in one of the coolest, and I mean coolest, boss fights in the entire game. I love the Zant fight. It's very creative in how it's kind of like a boss rush, but slightly remixed as you're fighting someone else. By the end of the fight, it becomes very fast-paced, which requires more quick on-your-feet thinking on how to take him down. If it wasn't for the fairy I had in a bottle, I wouldn't have beaten this first try. If this were the final dungeon in the game, I would have been so happy. But unfortunately, Hyrule Castle came directly after and just stunk up the final bit of the game like you were just about to dig out one of your favorite foods only to find it moldy and undercooked. Thanks, Mom. I don't know, it just kind of puts a huge sad frown on my face. Well, before I get too sad, let's move on to number 4. Okay, before I get into number 4, I feel like I have to ask, is the Lake Bed Temple a controversial dungeon? I know water temples in Zelda games are very controversial, especially the one from Ocarina of Time, but I can't help but really like the Lake Bed Temple. Like, I have no proper way of describing this. This temple was just dumb fun for me. Although at the start I was very, and I mean like, I was super skeptical due to me taking absolutely forever to find where I needed to go in the beginning, just like the water temple in Ocarina of Time. That alone just gave me very vivid flashbacks when starting the temple, but once I actually got into it, everything just flowed together really well. I crushed the puzzles in this dungeon and was hopping from room to room with absolute ease. I eventually got to the mini boss and received the claw shot, which only made this dungeon even better as so many routes opened up that weren't available to you beforehand. I'm saying all of this without even mentioning the main gimmick of the dungeon as well, being the whole water switching pulley mechanic deal. When you first enter this dungeon, you see these pulley levers and this huge slide in the middle, and this is where the fun really begins. And I think this has one of the most creative and fun hub rooms of any Zelda dungeon. It's the puzzle box aspect done correctly, and I think the water dungeon from Ocarina of Time tried to achieve it, but failed so hard to do so. There are a lot of elements from that dungeon that are then put in this one and should honestly not work because of how they failed in the previous dungeon. But these elements are refined to a point where the dungeon is an open puzzle box, but it keeps the linear style that we've been seeing throughout Twilight Princess, and it honestly creates for one of the best dungeons in the entire game. Messing with the water levels is honestly one of my favorite gimmicks in this entire game due to how expertly crafted it is. I was playing through this very late at night and wanted to go to bed. I don't know if it's because I was actually tired or what, but I entered a real flow state while going through this dungeon. I entered Ultra Instinct. Everything just clicked together and made sense. The biggest downside being the boss, which was fine. You know, it was good for the most part. I was trying to beat this boss at like 4 in the morning, so if I had more energy, I'd probably like it more, but as it stands, it's fine, I guess. Even though the Lake Bed Temple was very, very good, it doesn't even hold a candle to the top 3. So before we get into it, if I could kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers, and we're getting there. We're getting real close, and I would love to see you all there. Your support means the absolute world to me, and I do want to take this time to thank each and every one of you who have subscribed. But with all that out of the way, let's get back into the top 3. The Temple of Time just straight up blew me away. When I first played this game when I was about 12 years old, I absolutely hated this thing. It felt like the game was never ending at this point, and I just wanted to get through it as fast as I possibly could. And yeah, that's exactly what I did. It was so bad that I didn't really remember anything of it. And I remember that I hated it, and that was just really about it. So part of me was very excited to see if this dungeon was actually any good. And behold, yeah, it's at spot number 3. I'll let you decide if I liked it or not for yourself. This seems to be a very common trend when going back to replay Zelda games for me. It happened with Ocarina of Time, and now it's happening with Twilight Princess. This dungeon is linear to a fault. Like, I was just very surprised to see how linear this dungeon actually was. The Lake Bed Temple is so open compared to the Temple of Time. This is just the complete opposite. Before I get into that, however, I do want to talk about the awesome introduction to this dungeon. This introduction did wonders hyping me up for what was about to come. Being able to go back in time to the original Temple of Time from Ocarina of Time was an absolutely wonderful time. I said time way too many times. I'm sorry, I'm never gonna say that word again. But trust me when I say this, hearing the iconic temple music and being able to see where the Master Sword originally laid was an absolute treat to see and got my autistic Zelda neurons firing like crazy. And during the dungeon itself, you're immediately presented with a problem that you can't solve right now. And this is where things get really interesting, is yes, the dungeon is super linear. Pretty much all this area is that you walk from a line in a straight line that curves every once in a while from room to room. In the Forest Temple, there was a hub room that had multiple doors you can walk through, laid out like it were the Five Nights at Freddy's 2 office. You go from room to room like any other dungeon, but there aren't any diverging pathways. It's all one track, one straight track to the end, and then you face off against one of my favorite enemies in the game, honestly. After that, however, it all just clicks as you get the Dominion Rod. This allows you to control statues within the dungeon as the whole rest of the dungeon revolves around you going back through it in reverse while carrying this big awesome statue around to be able to complete the very first puzzle you encountered here. I was a complete dumbass and traveled back through to the beginning of the dungeon before I realized what I actually needed to do, so we'll just ignore that part. But that didn't deter from how much fun this dungeon was regardless. Everything is flipped on its head once you bring this giant statue with you as you complete puzzles in new and interesting ways, figuring out how to transport this thing around, and I just love that. You can use it to smash walls, block things coming at you. It's all done in such a creative and fun way. It all culminates in an awesome boss fight with Gomo, which honestly left a little bit of a sour taste in my mouth. I thought it ended a little too soon. It's a very gimmicky boss fight, and I love it for that. You use the Dominion Rod to smash it up on the wall and beat the absolute crap out of it, and it's such a fun boss fight. But then I got to the end of it, and I'm like, oh, that was it? I smash spiders like every day when I wake up, like that was it? Otherwise, the dungeon sits at a very comfortable S tier. And finally, we have reached the best of the best. The top two dungeons in The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, the Snow Peak Ruins and the Arbiter's Grounds. If the number 3 spot was a top tier S dungeon, these dungeons are also top tier S dungeons for their amazing layouts, use of mechanics, puzzles, and well, just everything. I don't really have a problem with any of these dungeons, and they go on to surpass my favorite dungeons from Ocarina of, Look, I said I wasn't gonna say that word anymore. I am a man of my word. The Spirit Temple is a very high bar to pass, and I think these dungeons are on par, and in aspects, completely surpass it. These dungeons are what made me love Twilight Princess to the degree I do, but only one of these dungeons can come out on top. So let's talk about that. The Snow Peak Ruins already became an S tier dungeon simply for the fact that it's an ice temple. In my first dungeon ranking video, I had talked about the ice cavern you take on before entering the water dungeon, and I mentioned how much I loved this area. From top to bottom, this area was pretty cool, and it only helped that it had one of my favorite aesthetics ever. The only reason it couldn't be higher on the list was because it was a mini dungeon. As much as I loved it, the area was far too short to be any higher than the 5th place. And I'm quite happy to report now that the Snow Peak Ruins is everything I could ask for in a Zelda dungeon. You're on top of this snow-ridden mountain and you go to this Yeti's mansion with his sick wife, and the whole gimmick of this place is just her directing you around to try and find the Mirror Shard, only for you to find food items to put into Yeto's stew. By the end of the dungeon, it actually becomes a superb soup, something so good it has Gordon Ramsay quaking in his boots. Oh, what an absolutely delicious and scrumptious soup you have here, Link. Not only are you the hero of Hyrule, but you are the hero of my stomach as well. Link, you have to tell me who made this absolutely delectable soup. I have to congratulate them, give them a Michelin star, whatever the hell we do, in absolute excellence. Link, is that a f***ing Yeti? Going around and completing tasks in the dungeons just feels so satisfying. Of course, the developers don't want to repeat their water temple mistakes and make this dungeon similar in scope and scale to the water dungeon. This should be an open puzzle box for players to figure out, but due to the linearity and structure of the game, I think it just works so much better in its favor that you go from room to room in a linear fashion. And it only gets better once you get the ball and chain and you can open up new pathways that you wouldn't be able to before. The central mechanics of this dungeon make it as great as it is because aesthetics can only take you so far. Well, at least this isn't the case for the dungeon. I just freaking adore ice breaking mechanics in this dungeon, okay? It's so simple, yet it works so effectively. Starting out by only being able to break ice with cannonballs requires a lot of out-of-the-box thinking. You need to think of where you need to shoot these cannonballs, because there's a lot of breakable ice around the area. It's an ice ruins thing, okay? you're gonna have ice. A lot of ice. It only becomes better once you actually obtain the ball and chain. You have no idea just how much fun it is to go around smashing giant blocks of ice and knocking things around with this item until you actually get it in your hands. Nintendo took a block of ice and went, this is from a male audience, and then made the Snow Peak Ruins temple. The boss is also very fun as well, being able to knock around Yetta with the ball and chain like it's air hockey. It's just such a fun gimmick. The ball and chain in general is an item I wish was used so much more in-game, which is unfortunately something I can also say about the spinner in the Arbiter's Grounds. The Arbiter's Grounds is a dungeon that has been talked about to absolute death on the internet. If you're a fan of Zelda, you know what the Arbiter's Grounds is and how many people absolutely adore this dungeon, and honestly, I can't blame anyone on why. This is an S-tier dungeon through and through. Where some areas may have some minor inconveniences and poor downsides, the Arbiter's Grounds has absolutely none of that and just excels in about everything it does. The setup is very similar to how you enter the Forest Temple in the first 3D Zelda, to an absolute T, if I'm being honest. The similarities were just absolutely jarring, kind of took me out of the experience, but honestly, it doesn't even matter because I think the Arbiter's Grounds takes the central idea of the original Forest Temple and has even more fun running with it. This dungeon easily has the greatest use of the wolf mechanic in the entire game, and it's a shame that it's never used again in full effect like this. At this point in the game, you have freshly obtained the ability to transform from wolf to human at any point in time, and this is about the only dungeon that fully integrates it into its design. Why that is, I couldn't be able to tell you. Nintendo just knew that they peaked with this dungeon and its mechanics and just never tried it again, who knows. What I do know is how well this mechanic is integrated into this dungeon's flow. You go around the dungeon looking for Poes, and you use the wolf form to track their scents as to where they might be. And it's not really an option to use the wolf either. You need this thing to advance further on in the dungeon, and I just absolutely love that. You're always looping around to the hub room like it's Luigi's Mansion, and it only gets better after you beat the mini-boss. The spinner just might be the greatest Zelda item ever, and it suffers from said greatness. The reason I say this is because once you obtain the spinner, you're already a good 75% of the way done with the dungeon, and you don't really get to do a lot with the spinner. You know, that's not to say what you do get to do with the spinner is bad, but once I beat the dungeon, I was just simply wanting more and more of this item, and I rarely ever got that. The puzzles utilizing the spinner are some of the best in the entire game. Not necessarily puzzle solving in that aspect, but on how fun they are to complete. This thing is just dumb fun, and I loved it until the very end. The bosses were a straight highlight, and of course, the amazing Star-Lord fight is just one of my favorite Zelda bosses of all time. And, you know, I can definitely see why this is a fan favorite. It's definitely one of the most memorable dungeons in the entire franchise. If I could give both of these dungeons the top spot, I definitely would, no questions asked. But unfortunately, only one can come out on top as the best dungeon in The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. In the end, this all boils down to one singular factor for me. I don't think a lot of people are gonna like this, but I hate the desert and just about everything that revolves around it. You already know the #1 spot goes to the Snow Peak Ruins. I'm telling you, it has that title for a reason. All I'm saying that is if the Arbiter's Ground was the #1 dungeon, it would have been called the Arbiter's Peak Dungeon, but unfortunately for all of us, it's not. And I'm not even joking when I say that it unfortunately boiled down to just the aesthetics of the dungeon. I found the mansion ruins on the mountaintop far more interesting than the Arbiter's Grounds, but that doesn't take away from how peak these dungeons truly are. Both the Arbiter's Grounds and the Snow Peak Ruins so far are my favorite dungeons in the entire franchise. The only thing that I can say compares to these dungeons is the Spirit Temple, and so believe me when I say that choosing the best dungeon in the game has never been harder. But before I log off for the day, I am curious to know, what is your favorite dungeon in Twilight Princess or just Zelda in general? Make sure to go ahead and let me know down in the comments below. But that's it from me today. If you liked what you saw, make sure to like and subscribe. Again, we're on the road to 1,000 subscribers, and I would love to see you all there. But otherwise, I'm logging off for the day. Stay fresh, everybody. I'm gonna see you all next time. Ah, damn it! I said it, didn't I? So, was it good for you? I told you that Dylonic guy was pretty cool. He also has a Discord server if you were wondering, which you should totally join because he talks about super cool and awesome things like Super Mario. No thanks. I'm good.